What happens when Hollywood royalty meets Bravo royalty and the gloves come off? You won't believe what unfolds when Meghan Markle sits down with Andy Cohen for what was supposed to be a career-boosting appearance, only to spiral into one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. The Duchess thought she could control the narrative, but she had no idea what she was walking into. The tension was palpable from the moment Meghan Markle stepped onto the Watch What Happens live set. Dressed in an immaculate cream blazer, she carried herself with the familiar air of calculated confidence that had become her trademark since leaving the royal family. But tonight, something felt different. Andy Cohen, seated behind his signature desk with that knowing smirk, had clearly done his homework. Welcome back to Watch What Happens Live. I'm Andy Cohen, and tonight we have the Duchess of Sussex herself, Meghan Markle, Andy announced to the studio audience, his voice carrying just the slightest edge seasoned viewers would recognize as a warning sign. The applause was polite, but not thunderous, and Meghan's smile tightened imperceptibly as she settled into the guest chair. Thank you so much for having me, Andy. I'm thrilled to be here, Meghan replied, her media-trained voice smooth as silk. But those who knew her tells could see the slight tension in her shoulders. She crossed her legs with practiced elegance, expecting the softball questions standard during her media tour. Andy leaned back in his chair, swirling his signature cocktail with deliberate casualness. So, Meghan, let's dive right in. You've been making quite the rounds lately, talking about your new projects, your life in California, but I have to ask about something on everyone's mind. He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. There's been a lot of talk about your relationship with your father, Thomas Markle. He's been pretty vocal in the press lately. The shift in Meghan's demeanor was instantaneous. Her perfectly applied smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before snapping back into place, but the damage was done. Andy had struck the first nerve of the evening, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Well, Andy, as I've said before, family relationships can be complicated. Meghan began, her voice measured but with a slight edge creeping in. I think it's important to focus on moving forward and the positive work we're doing with Archewell rather than dwelling on tabloid narratives. Andy nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't about to let her pivot easily. But these aren't just tabloid narratives, are they? Your father has been consistently trying to reach out, and from what I understand, he wasn't even invited to your wedding. That seems pretty definitive to me. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the typical celebrity puff piece they were used to seeing on late-night television. Meghan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she leaned forward slightly, a gesture body language experts would later analyze as defensive positioning. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about my family situation, Meghan replied, her voice now carrying a warning tone. My father made choices that put my safety and the safety of my new family at risk. Working with the tabloids, staging photographs, speaking to reporters without my knowledge or consent. Those aren't the actions of someone who has their daughter's best interests at heart. Andy raised an eyebrow, but he's also said publicly that he feels you've cut him off completely. He's mentioned wanting to meet his grandchildren, your children, with Harry. Doesn't he deserve a chance to make amends? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Meghan's media training was wearing with her irritation, and the careful mask she'd worn for years was beginning to slip. Her voice, when she finally spoke, had lost some of its polished smoothness. Andy, I find it interesting that you're taking the word of someone who has repeatedly violated my privacy and sold stories about me to the press over mine. My father had numerous opportunities to handle this situation privately, but he chose the public route every single time. Her tone was becoming sharper, more clipped. I have to protect my children from that kind of toxicity. The audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Andy, however, seemed energized by the pushback. He leaned forward, his expression a mixture of journalistic curiosity and barely contained excitement at having cracked through her carefully constructed facade. I'm not taking anyone's word over anyone else's, Andy replied, his voice taking on that particular tone he reserved for celebrities who thought they could control his show. I'm asking questions that I think the audience wants answered. And speaking of protecting your children, there's been some criticism about how you and Harry have handled your privacy concerns while simultaneously doing very public interviews and projects. Some people see that as hypocritical. The word hypocritical hit Meghan like a physical blow. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the arms of her chair, and for a moment, her composure cracked completely. The woman who had faced down the British tabloids and emerged victorious in court battles was suddenly faced with an opponent she hadn't fully prepared for, an interviewer who wasn't intimidated by her title or her legal team. It's a completely unfair characterization, Meghan shot back, her voice rising slightly above its carefully modulated tone. We've been incredibly selective about when and how we share our story. Everything we've done has been about correcting the record and fighting back against years of lies and racist attacks from the British media. Andy's eyes lit up at the mention of racism, clearly recognizing another avenue to explore. I absolutely support your right to fight back against racist coverage. But some critics have pointed out that you seem to invoke racism specifically when other criticisms don't stick. Even Piers Morgan has said don't, Meghan interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. Don't you dare quote Piers Morgan to me. That man has been obsessed with me for years, and his behavior has been borderline stalking. The fact that you would even mention his name in this context shows exactly what kind of interview this really is. The studio had gone dead silent. This was no longer a celebrity chat. This was a confrontation, and everyone present could feel the electricity crackling between host and guest. Andy's expression had shifted from playful to serious. Recognizing that he had pushed the right button at exactly the right moment, Meghan, I'm simply asking about public statements and criticisms that are out there. If you can't handle questions about your public persona and the choices you've made, maybe doing interviews isn't the right move. Andy replied, his voice calm, but with an unmistakable steel underneath. The implication was clear. She had walked into his house, and she would play by his rules. Meghan's face flushed slightly, a combination of anger and embarrassment at being so directly challenged on live television. She had clearly expected the differential treatment she'd grown accustomed to from sympathetic interviewers, not this relentless probing into the contradictions and controversies surrounding her public image. I can handle questions just fine, Andy, Meghan replied, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. What I can't handle is the continued perpetuation of false narratives and hit pieces disguised as journalism. I came here tonight thinking this would be a respectful conversation about my work and my projects, not another opportunity for you to pile on with the same tired talking points that have been used against me for years. Andy sat down his cocktail and looked directly at her, his expression now completely serious. This is respectful conversation, Meghan. These are legitimate questions about your public statements and actions. If you find them uncomfortable, maybe that says something about the positions you've taken, rather than the questions I'm asking. The commercial break that followed felt like the calm before a hurricane. During the brief intermission, Meghan could be seen adjusting her blazer with sharp, agitated movements while Andy conferred quietly with his producers. When the cameras rolled again, the atmosphere in the studio had somehow grown even more charged. Welcome back to Watch What Happens Live, Andy announced, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone that regular viewers knew meant someone was about to get eviscerated. We're here with Meghan Markle, and we were just discussing some of the public criticism surrounding her media strategy. He turned to face her directly, and the smile on his face was anything but friendly. Now, Meghan, I want to talk about something that's been bothering a lot of people. You and Harry did that massive Oprah interview where you made some pretty serious allegations about the royal family. But since then, several of your claims have been, let's say, questioned. Meghan's entire body tensed. This was the minefield she had hoped to avoid, but Andy was walking straight into it with the confidence of someone who had done his research and wasn't afraid to use it. I stand by everything we said in that interview, Meghan replied, her voice ice cold. Every single word was the truth. And frankly, I'm tired of having to defend our lived experience to people who weren't there and have no idea what we went through. Andy leaned back, clearly relishing the moment. But that's just it, Meghan. Some of your lived experience doesn't seem to match up with documented facts. For instance, you claimed you and Harry were married 3 days before the royal wedding in a private ceremony. But the Archbishop of Canterbury himself later clarified that what you had was a private exchange of vows, not a legal marriage. That's a pretty significant distinction. The color drained from Meghan's face. She had clearly not expected Andy to dive this deep into the specifics, and her media training hadn't prepared her for someone who would fact-check her claims in real time on live television. That's semantics, she shot back, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. The important thing was the spiritual and emotional commitment we made to each other. The legal ceremony was just for the public. Semantics, Andy repeated, eyebrows raised. Meghan, you literally told Oprah that you got married 3 days before. Those were your exact words. And when the head of the Church of England has to publicly correct your statement, that's not semantics. That's a factual error at best, and at worst, what? Meghan snapped, her composure finally beginning to crack in earnest. What exactly are you implying, Andy? The studio audience was now completely riveted. This had gone far beyond typical celebrity gossip and had entered the realm of journalistic confrontation. I'm not implying anything, Meghan, I'm stating facts. And the fact is, you made claims in that interview that were demonstrably false. The timeline you gave about when you supposedly had your passport and keys taken away doesn't match documented royal engagements you attended. Your claim about not knowing anything about Harry or the royal family before you met is contradicted by your own social media posts and interviews where you talked about Princess Diana and the royal wedding. Each point hit Meghan like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed narrative was being dismantled, piece by piece, on live television, and she was clearly struggling to maintain her composure. You're cherry-picking details and taking things out of context, she protested, but her voice was now shaking with barely controlled rage. You're doing exactly what the British tabloids did, twisting my words and ignoring the bigger picture of institutional racism and the mental health crisis I was going through. Andy's expression didn't soften. If anything, he seemed to sense weakness and pressed harder. I'm not twisting anything, Meghan. I'm quoting you directly. And speaking of mental health, you claimed in that interview that you were denied help when you reached out. But multiple royal correspondents have since revealed that the palace has an extensive support system for family members, including mental health resources. Are you saying that entire system was kept secret from you specifically? The question was devastating in its precision. Meghan's face had gone from pale to flushed, and her hands were visibly trembling. She was clearly out of her depth, facing an interviewer who had done his homework and wasn't intimidated by her victim narrative. Those royal correspondents are mouthpieces for the institution, she replied, her voice rising. Of course, they're going to defend the system. You have no idea what it was like to be trapped in that situation, to have your every move monitored and controlled. But you weren't trapped, were you? Andy shot back. You left. You made the choice to step back from royal duties and move to California. You had agency throughout this entire situation. Yet you continued to present yourself as a victim with no options. The word victim seemed to trigger something primal in Meghan. Her eyes flashed with genuine anger, and for the first time all evening, her media training completely abandoned her. How dare you? She hissed. How dare you sit there and minimize what I went through? You have no idea what it's like to have an entire institution turn against you, to have the press write lies about you every single day, to fear for your safety and the safety of your unborn child. Andy remained unmoved by her emotional outburst. I don't minimize anything, Meghan, but I also don't think being asked legitimate questions about inconsistencies in your public statements constitutes an attack. You've built a media empire on your royal experience and your grievances against the institution. If you're going to profit from that story, you should expect it to be scrutinized. The word profit was like a red flag to a bull. Meghan's face contorted with fury, and she leaned forward aggressively in her chair. Profit, she spat. We've used our platform to highlight important causes and give voice to the voiceless. Everything we've done has been about service and making a positive impact on the world. Andy's laugh was short and humorless. Service, Meghan, you signed a $100 million deal with Netflix. You have podcast deals, book deals, speaking engagements that command six-figure fees. Your service has made you incredibly wealthy. Let's not pretend this is all altruistic. The studio went dead silent again, but this time, the energy was different. The audience could sense that something fundamental had shifted, that this confrontation had reached a point of no return. Meghan's face was now bright red with rage and humiliation. Our success doesn't negate our commitment to service, she replied through gritted teeth. And frankly, I find it interesting that a man who built his career on gossip and celebrity drama is lecturing me about authenticity and public service. It was a low blow, and everyone in the room knew it. Andy's expression darkened considerably, and his voice took on a tone his regular guests knew meant they had crossed a line. At least I'm honest about what I do. Meghan, I don't pretend to be saving the world while cashing checks and settling scores with my family on international television. I don't claim to want privacy while doing tell-all interviews and reality shows. The tension in the studio was suffocating as Andy and Meghan stared each other down across the desk. The audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing what would undoubtedly go down as one of the most explosive celebrity interviews in television history. You know what, Meghan, Andy said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. Since we're being honest here, let's talk about the real elephant in the room. Your pattern of burning bridges with everyone who doesn't give you exactly what you want. Meghan's eyes widened in shock and fury. Excuse me, your father, your half-sister, your former friends, the royal family, former staff members who've all spoken out about working with you. At what point do you look in the mirror and ask yourself if maybe you're the common denominator in all these fractured relationships? The question hit like a nuclear bomb. Meghan's mouth fell open, and when she finally found her voice, it was shaking with rage. How dare you suggest that I'm responsible for other people's betrayals? These people sold me out for money and fame. They couldn't handle my success. Andy leaned forward, eyes blazing. Or maybe they couldn't handle your behavior. Your former best friend, Jessica Mulroney, your father, palace staff, they all tell the same story about someone who demands absolute loyalty but gives none in return. That's complete nonsense. Meghan shot back, but her voice cracked. My father chose the tabloids over his own daughter. The palace staff leaked stories about me to protect other members of the family. Did they? Andy challenged. Or did they finally get tired of being blamed for everything while you played the victim? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've turned victimhood into a brand. And anyone who questions that narrative gets thrown under the bus. Meghan's hands were clenched into fists. She was clearly struggling to maintain any semblance of composure. I will not sit here and let you psychoanalyze me based on tabloid gossip, she hissed. You don't know me, and you certainly don't know what I've been through. Andy's smile was razor sharp. but I do know what you've said publicly, and your version of events keeps changing. In the Oprah interview, you claimed you never Googled Harry or the royal family. But years earlier, you posted about watching William and Kate's wedding. Which version is true, Meghan? The direct confrontation with her contradictions was devastating. Meghan's carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time. Those are completely different contexts. She stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. I may have been aware of major royal events, but I didn't research Harry specifically. But that's not what you said, Andy pressed relentlessly. You painted yourself as this naive American who stumbled into royal life completely unprepared. But your own social media history contradicts that entire narrative. Meghan was now visibly shaken with rage and humiliation. You're twisting everything. You're taking things out of context and building a narrative that fits your agenda. My agenda, Andy laughed bitterly. Meghan, I'm using your own words. If your narrative doesn't hold up to basic scrutiny, that's not my problem. That's yours. The breaking point had arrived. Meghan suddenly stood up from her chair, her movement so abrupt it startled everyone in the studio. I don't have to sit here and listen to this character assassination, she declared, her voice shaking. This isn't journalism. This is a hit job, and I refuse to participate in it. Andy remained seated, looking up at her with mock concern. Meghan, sit down. If you can't handle having your public statements questioned, maybe you shouldn't make them in the first place. Don't you dare tell me to sit down, Meghan snapped, her composure completely gone. I came here in good faith, and instead you've spent the entire time attacking me with lies and distortions. I've spent the entire time asking you about things you've said publicly. Andy replied calmly. If you consider that an attack, what does that say about the things you've said? The question was the final straw. Meghan's face contorted with rage, and she took a step toward the desk. You know what this is really about? She shouted. This is about a bitter man who makes his living tearing down successful women. You can't stand that I've built something meaningful while you're still sitting behind this desk gossiping. Andy's expression darkened, but he leaned back with a cold smile. At least I'm honest about what I do, Meghan. And at least when I leave this studio tonight, I won't have to explain to my publicist why I just had a complete meltdown on live television. The words were like a slap in the face. Meghan seemed to suddenly realize that she was having a breakdown while millions of people watched. This interview is over, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with venom. I will not be subjected to this kind of treatment. She turned and began walking toward the exit, her movements sharp and aggressive. But Andy wasn't finished. Running away again, Meghan, he called after her. Just like you ran from the royal family when things got tough. Just like you run from every situation where you don't get to control the narrative. Meghan stopped dead in her tracks. For a moment, it looked like she might turn around, but instead, she kept walking, her shoulders rigid with fury. Give my regards to Harry, Andy added as she reached the door. I'm sure he'll be thrilled to see how this went. Meghan paused at the door, her hand on the handle. The cameras caught her face in profile, and the expression of pure rage and defeat was unmistakable. Then she yanked the door open and disappeared into the hallway. Andy turned back to the cameras, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. The audience sat in complete silence. Well, Andy said finally, straightening his tie, I guess that's one way to end an interview. The most explosive celebrity interview in recent memory was over, ending with a dramatic exit that would be replayed for years to come. Meghan Markle had walked into Andy Cohen's domain thinking she could control the conversation, only to discover that some narratives can't be managed, and some interviewers refused to be charmed into submission. The Duchess had finally met her match, and the entire world had watched her crumble under pressure. The interview that was supposed to rehabilitate her public persona had instead become the defining moment that exposed the contradictions her critics had long suspected. This was a battle that Meghan Markle had not only lost, but lost spectacularly and on the biggest stage possible.